So people often ask me how you can kind of break out of that thing that you kind of get stuck in often of just regurgitating learned solo phrases. You know, and I suffered from the same thing. I used to go to workshops all over the country and I'd learn these different phrases, and then when I soloed, all I could do was just churn out 4 of those and then 4 of those and then 4 of those. And you know, when you watch djembefolas solo, they're not doing that. So I've got several techniques that I use to help me improvise in my solos and not just play those learned phrases over and over again. One of those techniques is what I call my solo rudiments, so see my other videos for that. They're techniques you can use to fill in the gaps in between learned solo phrases. But another technique that I use a lot in my own solo and that I teach to my students is to take a learned solo phrase, break it down into its constituent parts and then play around with those parts. So out of each solo phrase you can get kind of 6 or 7 other little mini solo phrases that use the same parts that came from that phrase. So probably the best way to illustrate is by way of example. So I'm going to use a phrase that I learned from Iyasako. It also uses one of what I call solo rudiments. The rudiment that goes kum ga kum ga kum ga kum ga kum. I've shown you that in one of my other videos. Anyway, I'll show you the phrase, then I'll break it down. So in 4/4 from signal. In 4/4 from signal. There we go, sorry for the false start at the beginning. Okay, so the phrase kum ga kum ga kum ga kum ga kum ga da gun ga ding ga da gun. What I'm going to do is take out all of the little constituent parts of that solo phrase. One I've already done in another video and I call it a solo rudiment. So just the first bit of that phrase is kum ga kum ga kum ga kum ga kum on its own. And of course, buried in there as well is just all using those same elements. Okay, so let's move on to the next bit of the phrase. We get kum ga kum ga kum ga kum ga kum ga da ka. So ga da ka is another bit of the solo phrase. So ga da ga is another little bit. Now let's move on further in the phrase. Kum ga kum ga kum ga kum ga kum ga da gang gang king ga da ga gang king. Taken that out of the phrase. So now I've got kum ga kum ga kum ga kum ga kum. I've got ga da ga. I've got gang king, and I've got ga da ga. I've got 4 elements out of my solo phrase. So now I'm going to play around with those elements to make a slightly freer solo, hopefully. So from signal. I used all of those little elements out of the solo phrase and kind of picked them apart and changed them back to front and created an improvised solo sequence out of one solo phrase. If you do that with all of your phrases, rather than just regurgitate them 4 times and then move on to the next one, you'll have a much freer type of solo that you can play around with, but still using elements that you've learned. So that's the technique. Enjoy.